administration for 8 years, and I'm doing my presentation today on supplier ratios. And we're going to break them down and go into some of the little things that they can do for you. I'm being assisted by Jenny Cooper. She's my organizer, and so she's going to be watching the chat messages and making sure that any questions you guys have that we get to today. So let's start off. Everybody can see my screen. Not my first supplier ratio, wrangling your supplier ratios. Supplier ratios are a piece of Paladin that I find interesting because once it clicks in your brain, supplier ratios are actually really straightforward and easy. But it seems that for everyone, even technicians here, about average, I have to explain it about 4 times. So if you don't get it on the first try, not a problem. Hopefully this webinar will speed along that process, and maybe it'll click during this presentation for you. And then after that, basically, once it's in your brain, usually you just are able to figure it out after that. So let's go ahead and start off. Stuff that we're going to cover: identifying items that need a supplier ratio. That's the biggest first step that you have to take. Finding out, do I actually need a supplier ratio on this item, yes or no? We're going to go through some common items that need a supplier ratio. We're going to talk about setting up the order quantity and supplier ratios, and also the item cost and pricing level. Talk a little bit about reference margins and rounding schemes, because while a reference margin and rounding scheme isn't technically required for a supplier ratio item, it does actually, they're kissing cousins. It rounds out everything else. We're also going to talk about reverse supplier ratios and what those are. Also, purchasing an item with a supplier ratio is a little different than the way you've been doing them in the past. And also, we're going to talk about cut charges too. All right, so identifying items that need supplier ratios. So let's say your supplier sells you a keg of beer, and you actually sell it by the glass. Okay, this item needs a supplier ratio. Now, some of the common items that are going to need supplier ratios: chain, rope, and wire. Every time I walk into a store when I'm doing an on-site install, or whenever somebody calls me, this is the first thing I check. I go over and I go look at all the chain, look at all the rope, make sure it's all set up. Pipe and bulk nails. Pipe sometimes needs a supplier ratio, sometimes it needs a reverse supplier ratio, depending on what it is and how the supplier sends it to you. Bulk nails, same idea. You buy a 50-pound 50-pound bag or 50-pound box of nails, and you just basically pour it into the bin. Well, you're going to need a supplier ratio to sell that by the pound. Bunches, packs, cases, and bunches, or bundles, packs, cases, and bunches. I've found these items every once in a while where a supplier will sell you a case of something and also send you all the information by the case. So they'll send you the cost and retails by the case, and then you have to break them up. That's where supplier ratio comes in. So let's actually look at an item real quick. So we have the supplier and your store. So the supplier sells you 1 spool of chain, and in your store there's 250 feet of chain because you sell it by the foot. So your order quantity is going to be 250. And this is one of the concepts, and we'll talk a little bit more about this when we go to purchasing these things, is that throughout the years, without supplier ratios, or even maybe before Paladin, your employees got used to walking by the chain, wire, and rope racks and looking at it and go, oh, that spindle looks, or that spool looks like it's almost empty. I'll order 1 spool of that. Well, with Paladin, and also using the suggested order report, we want to change that line of thinking. We want to change that line of thinking into feet. So it's not so much when you look up at the rack and go, oh, I need 1 spool. You really need however many feet. Also with that, you need a supplier ratio. So a supplier ratio is 1 divided by whatever the amount of units are in 1 unit that is sent from the supplier. So in this case, 1 spool equals 250 feet, so it's 1 divided by 250, which comes out to 0.004. And what it is I showed you right here, where the order quantity is now 250 and supplier ratio is 0.004. If you notice, I've locked these. Locking is not required. I find that locking them, though, is a lot less maintenance because EDI will change these back, and also sometimes EDI will change these to the correct numbers. But I don't leave anything to chance. I'm a technician, so I always lock these two things just to make sure that they always stay this way. These two locks will ensure that EDI does not touch these. Okay, so cost and pricing levels. So the cost per spool is from the supplier. So the supplier is sending you the cost per the whole spool. And at your store, you want your average cost to be by the foot. You also want your market cost to be by the foot. So everything in your store is going to be by the foot. Also pricing level 1, and they're sending their retail price per spool. Now how you can find out, is a supplier doing this? The easiest way is look on the EDI. The EDI report will actually show you what the data is coming over from them. So if you look at a spool of chain and it shows the per spool price, then you're going to need a supplier ratio. If they're sending it to you by the foot, which I have seen before, it's very rare that they were going to send it to you by the foot, but I have seen that before. If that's the case, no supplier ratio needed. You don't have to touch it, okay? Now, one thing that we also do here is I have a pricing level 2. Pricing level 2, I have the quantity is the total feet per spool. And the sale price is per the spool because we still want to be able to sell this by the spool. Now, here's how this looks. So I've got an average cost and market cost of 40 cents. And I sell this by the foot for 99 cents. So I make about a 59% margin, 60% margin there. Now I also have, if somebody wants to buy the whole spool, I'm going to sell it to them at a really discounted rate. I'm only going to make 23% margin on it, but they're buying the whole spool, so I don't have to worry about waste and stuff like that from doing any cuts, and I don't have to have any manpower to go and cut that thing with them. All right, so now here we go into reference margins and rounding schemes. Now, the good part about reference margins and rounding schemes is they automatically account for lost revenue when you cut product to order. So just like in my previous slide that you saw where I added 30% margin onto the item because I had to cut it. And that was just to cover my costs. And also, the problem is that once you get down to the last foot or maybe 2 feet or 3 feet, you may or may not be able to sell that off. Sometimes you get lucky, sometimes you don't. Also, with cuts, you're always losing a little bit per cut. So you cut that one link, that link's gone. That's going to account for a few inches here and there. So you can actually, with reference margins and rounding schemes, set that stuff up. It can also give you control over your margins so you can remain competitive. If you know somebody down the street is selling it for less, you can actually change your reference margin, and the computer will start using that as what you want to sell it with. And with the rounding schemes, it can still stay with psychological pricing. And also, it automatically adjusts your retail price, just like I said. Automatically adjust your retail price so that way you don't have to worry about it anymore. And with a rounding scheme, it keeps your retail price on bulk items in line with the other items in your store. Psychological pricing basically is prices ending in a 9. And sometimes I've gone into stores where people still want to maintain that 99 or 9. And in this slide right here, that's what I've done. So I have my quantity of 1 of 99 cents. I have a reference margin of 59% margin because I know that the rounding is going to adjust, always going to round up. So if the price came in at 89 cents, it's going to round it up to 99 cents. And so I want my reference margin to be a little lower, and I've got to the 9s as my rounding scheme. Also on my quantity of 250, the whole spool, I have the price of $129.99, and I have a 23% margin. All right, reverse supplier ratios. Reverse supplier ratios is when you have decided as a store owner that your supplier is sending you something by the each, but you don't want to sell it by the each. You want to sell it by the whole stick. I see this a lot in pipe. Some pipe I've seen where suppliers will send you the information by the actual foot. And I saw this with commodities. It was copper piping, I believe. The store owner didn't want to actually sell it by the foot because they didn't want to get into the whole cut thing because they didn't cut anything else. And so they wanted to be able to sell it by the whole stick. Now I'm going to show you how I set this up. So supplier sends me 10 feet of pipe. So I have to buy 10 feet of pipe at a time, and they send me one stick, and I sell one stick. So my order quantity is going to be 10. I've got to buy it in tens. My supplier ratio, though, is 1 because I'm not actually breaking this item up into smaller units. I'm actually making it into a bigger unit, and I'll show you how that actually is accomplished here in just a second. Now, your cost is going to be by the foot. They're sending you the cost by the foot. Unfortunately, your cost is going to be your average, and your market cost is going to have to be by the foot. Now, your retail price for 1 foot, so pricing level 1 is going to be the retail price for your stick. Okay. Also, pricing level 2 for a quantity of 10 is also going to be by the stick. Yes, I know that the pricing level 1 and 2 are the same retail price. Here's how this works. So somebody brings a pipe up to your cash register and you scan it. All right. Now, there's a setting that I'll show you here in just a minute or so that will actually default everything to the highest quantity price break. Basically what that means is if we have this item set up exactly this way, what will happen is that when you scan the pipe SKU, or when you type it in, it's going to automatically come up with a quantity of 10 for $5.99. Now, if you have a cashier who's maybe tries to outthink the system a little bit and goes, oh, well, no, it's just 1 stick, and change the quantity to 1, it's still going to be the same price. So they're not selling a stick by the foot for the foot price. So you're not going to lose any money out of it. Your stock on hand may be a little bit off, but that can be adjusted easily. We're really more worried about making sure that our customers are paying the right price for our items. So that's how we do reverse supplier ratios. Now here's that thing that I was talking about earlier, the default invoice quantity handling. And what this will do is it'll default the largest pricing quantity when added to invoices. And that's in the File Setup Company tab. And you can check it. I suggest every retailer do that, no matter what. It defaulting to the highest quantity will only save you money. And you know what? If they're only buying a foot, they're not going to pay $5.99 for it. Even if it was a true supplier ratio item, if they only have 2 feet and it comes up as a 10-foot shot or 250 feet, the customer will speak right up and say, oh, well, I didn't get 250 feet. Where if they're getting 250 feet and you charge them the per foot price, if they have other things on the invoice, they may not even notice. And it's not anything nefarious. It's just, hey, we're human. Where if we're defaulting always to the highest quantity, then there's no worry. Okay, so on purchase orders, we talked about this. So your supplier is looking for you to send a purchase order for 1 spool. Okay. Now with a supplier ratio on your purchase order, you're going to put 250 feet. Or if you use a suggested order, it's going to ask for 250 feet. Now, when that purchase order is sent to your supplier, it will automatically change that 250 feet to 1 spool. So that way, you're not getting 250 spools from your supplier. Okay? And let's talk about cut charges. So cut charges can be handled in actually a few different ways. One of the ones that I like doing is just factor the cut charge into the individual price with a reference margin. It's easy. Generally, it's not going to throw you out of line being competitive with the other stores in your area. You can also use the core charge function to collect a fee. Now, the core charge is, if no one knows what a core charge is basically, comes from the automotive industry. If anybody's ever had to change out an alternator, you buy a new alternator, and if you bring your old alternator back, they give you a core charge and refund that money. Same thing happens here, is we have an item or a SKU that would have a core charge on it, so that way that would be your cut charge. And the core charge function, we do allow for you to adjust what that says. So it wouldn't show up as a core charge. It could show up as a cut charge if you'd like. So that is an option. It would just automatically show up on all the items that you have it set up on. Oops. Or you could use a dump SKU. Sometimes that's easier. I had one store who liked this option better because then they could actually dictate, how much they were actually doing in cut charges. Also, using the dump SKU adds another good thing to it, is that you can have the dump SKU be non-taxable because it's technically labor. Where if you factor it into the cut charge of the individual with the reference margin, it just factors into the price. So, and that's it. That's it for me. So for more information, see the following knowledge-based topics about the supplier ratio and reverse supplier ratios, how to add a supplier ratio to an item, and how to do a reverse supplier ratio to an item. Also, there's another webinar that actually has for the reference margins and rounding schemes that I did before. So you can always watch that one to see how to touch those things up. So Jenny, do we have any questions?
No, we do not.
No, we do not. Okay, well, thank you everybody for coming. I hope you learned a lot.